In 1973, two towers opened in Lower Manhattan. They were the tallest buildings in the world. Within 2 decades, they would become the most photographed structures on Earth. But that fame required deaths nobody counted during construction, deaths nobody prevented in 1993, and deaths nobody could stop in 2001. 60 workers fell or were crushed building them. 6 died when a bomb tried to topple them. 2,977 perished when fire brought them down. This is the story of the World Trade Center, not the symbol we remember, the cost we forgot. The fortune that built the World Trade Center came from one of the most powerful families in American history. David Rockefeller was born in 1915, grandson of John Rockefeller, the oil baron who had built Standard Oil into the largest monopoly America had ever known. The family wealth was incomprehensible. By the 1950s, David Rockefeller controlled Chase Manhattan Bank. He owned property throughout Lower Manhattan, and he watched that property lose value year after year. Lower Manhattan was dying. Through the 1940s and 1950s, businesses fled northward to Midtown. The crooked streets below Wall Street were cramped, dirty, obsolete. The waterfront was decaying. Container shipping required deep ports and vast storage space. Manhattan had neither. The ports moved to New Jersey. The businesses followed. By 1960, Lower Manhattan was, in Rockefeller's words, a ghost town after 5 p.m. Rockefeller had built Chase Manhattan's new headquarters at 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza in 1960. The 60-story tower cost $121 million. It was supposed to anchor downtown's revival. It failed. The building struggled to find tenants. Companies wanted Midtown addresses. They wanted Park Avenue and 6th Avenue. Nobody wanted the financial district. Rockefeller's investment was hemorrhaging value. In 1958, Rockefeller founded the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association to promote development in the area. He needed something dramatic, something that would force the world to pay attention to Lower Manhattan again. He proposed a World Trade Center, a complex that would gather all the scattered institutions of international commerce under one roof: banks, customs brokers, shipping companies, import-export firms, government trade agencies, all concentrated in Lower Manhattan, all generating activity, jobs, foot traffic, prestige. Rockefeller hired McKinsey & Company to study the feasibility. The consultants delivered bad news. The World Trade Center made no sense. Major corporations already had access to trade services. There was no need to consolidate them. More importantly, the report said, placing the center in Lower Manhattan guaranteed failure. Everyone knew the important businesses had relocated to Midtown. Why would anyone suffer the inconvenience of going downtown? Rockefeller fired McKinsey. He hired the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, the same firm that had designed his Chase Manhattan headquarters. He told them to produce plans for a World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. The project was not about demand. It was about Rockefeller's property values and his family's legacy. His father had built Rockefeller Center in Midtown during the 1930s. David would build something even grander downtown. The project required a powerful partner. Only one organization in the New York region had the authority and resources to condemn property, close streets, and finance a project of this scale: the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The Port Authority managed the region's bridges, tunnels, airports, and shipping facilities. It generated substantial toll revenue and could issue bonds without state approval. Its executive director, Austin Tobin, was the second highest paid public official in America after the president. Tobin had his own motivations. The Port Authority's original mission was managing ports and maritime commerce, but container shipping was moving to New Jersey. The authority needed a new purpose to justify its existence and its revenue stream. A World Trade Center would provide that purpose. It would be a monument to the Port Authority's relevance. There was a problem. The World Trade Center required approval from both New York and New Jersey governors. New York's governor was Nelson Rockefeller, David's brother. Nelson supported the project. But New Jersey's governor, Robert Minor, saw no benefit for New Jersey residents. Why should the Port Authority spend billions to build office towers in Manhattan? Minor refused. The project stalled until 1961, when New Jersey elected a new governor, Richard Hughes. David Rockefeller and Austin Tobin negotiated a deal. The Port Authority would take over the bankrupt Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, which carried New Jersey commuters into Manhattan. The Port Authority would renovate it and rename it the Port Authority Trans-Hudson Line, PATH. In exchange, New Jersey would support the World Trade Center. The deal was made. The project was approved. The site chosen was Radio Row, a neighborhood along the west side of Lower Manhattan. Since the 1920s, the area had housed hundreds of small electronics shops. They sold used radios, war surplus equipment, vacuum tubes, transistors, junk. The stores were cramped and chaotic. Parts spilled onto sidewalks. Collectors and hobbyists came from across the city to dig through bins looking for obscure components. Radio Row was the birthplace of the electronics distribution business in America. It would be destroyed entirely. The Port Authority planned to seize 164 buildings through eminent domain, close 5 streets, and demolish 13 city blocks. Approximately 1,000 small businesses would be evicted. Roughly 30,000 people worked in the area. They would lose their livelihoods. The business owners formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association to fight the seizure. They challenged the Port Authority in court. They argued that the World Trade Center was not a legitimate public purpose, that it was a real estate scheme designed to benefit Rockefeller's property values. They lost. The courts ruled that the Port Authority had the authority to seize the property. In March 1965, the Port Authority began acquiring the land. Demolition began in March 1966. The shops were emptied, the buildings came down. Within months, 13 blocks of Lower Manhattan were cleared to bare ground. The architect chosen for the project was Minoru Yamasaki. He was born in 1912 in Seattle, the son of Japanese immigrants. His father worked in a shoe store. Yamasaki grew up poor, enduring racism throughout his childhood. He graduated from the University of Washington's architecture program in 1934 with $40 in his pocket and moved to New York to escape anti-Japanese discrimination. He found work as a draftsman. During World War II, the firm he worked for, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon, designers of the Empire State Building, helped him avoid internment. By the 1960s, Yamasaki had established his own firm in Detroit. He had designed several acclaimed buildings, including the U.S. Science Pavilion at the 1962 Seattle World's Fair. His work emphasized what he called humanist architecture. He believed buildings should provide serenity, surprise, and delight. He wanted architecture that reflected humanity's nobility, not its power. He used decorative elements, Gothic-inspired arches, light-filled atriums. He rejected the stark austerity of the international style that dominated modernism. In September 1962, the Port Authority selected Yamasaki from a shortlist that included I.M. Pei, Philip Johnson, Welton Beckett, and Walter Gropius. The commission was extraordinary. The Port Authority wanted 10 million square feet of office space, the largest commercial complex ever built. Yamasaki's firm had 55 employees. When he received the initial plans, he thought they had added an extra 0 by mistake. He could not believe his small firm could manage a project of such magnitude. The Port Authority did not want one building, it wanted 2 towers. Twin towers, identical, each 110 stories tall. Together, they would contain more office space than the Empire State Building, Chrysler Building, and 30 Rockefeller Plaza combined. The towers would be the tallest buildings in the world. They would dominate the Manhattan skyline. They would make Lower Manhattan unmissable. Yamasaki was ambivalent. His architectural philosophy emphasized human scale. He believed buildings should welcome people, not intimidate them. The Port Authority wanted monuments. They wanted structures so large they would overwhelm everything around them. Yamasaki tried to humanize the design. He used narrow windows because he had a fear of heights and assumed others did too. He designed Gothic arches at the base where the exterior columns merged. He created a vast plaza between the towers where people could gather. But the scale remained inhuman. The towers would stand 1,368 and 1,362 feet tall. They would be the ultimate expression of corporate power and American dominance. The structural design was revolutionary. Yamasaki worked with structural engineer Fazlur Rahman Khan, a Bangladeshi-American engineer who had pioneered the framed tube design. Traditional skyscrapers used steel columns throughout the interior to support the weight of the floors. This limited open floor space and required numerous support columns that interrupted office layouts. Khan and Yamasaki designed the twin towers as hollow tubes. All the structural support would come from closely spaced steel columns on the exterior walls, 59 columns per side, and a core of columns in the center housing elevators and utilities. The floors would be supported by lightweight trusses spanning between the exterior walls and the central core. This design created vast, column-free office floors. Tenants could configure the space however they wanted. No interior columns interrupted the layout. The design also saved weight and materials, making the towers economically feasible. But it created a vulnerability. The structural load was carried by the exterior walls and the floor trusses connecting them to the core. If those connections failed, the floors would collapse. The exterior walls alone could not support the building's weight. Groundbreaking took place on August 5, 1966. The site presented unique challenges. Lower Manhattan had been built on landfill. The bedrock was 65 feet below street level. Worse, the site was less than 1,000 feet from the Hudson River. The water table was high. Any excavation would flood immediately. Conventional dewatering, pumping groundwater out to keep the site dry, would cause surrounding buildings to settle and crack. John M. Kyle Jr., the Port Authority's chief engineer, devised a solution. They would build a massive retaining wall around the entire site before excavation began. The wall would be constructed using the slurry method, a technique borrowed from European construction. Workers would dig a trench 3 feet wide and 65 feet deep around the perimeter of the site. As they dug, they filled the trench with a mixture of bentonite clay and water. The slurry plugged holes in the soil and kept the trench walls from collapsing. Once the trench reached bedrock, workers lowered in a steel reinforcement cage and poured concrete, displacing the slurry. The result was a continuous concrete wall, 3 feet thick and 7 stories deep, running 3,000 feet around the site. It became known as the bathtub because it held back the Hudson River and the surrounding groundwater. The bathtub was essential. Without it, the site would flood and the towers could not be built. It took 14 months to complete. The work was led by Icanda, a Montreal-based subsidiary of an Italian engineering firm. Once the bathtub was finished, excavation began. Workers removed 1.2 million cubic yards of earth and rock. Rather than transporting the material to New Jersey landfills at great expense, the Port Authority used it to extend Manhattan's shoreline 700 feet into the Hudson River. The new land would become Battery Park City. The excavation uncovered remnants of Manhattan's maritime past, including the remains of 18th-century ships buried under the landfill. Construction of the towers began in 1968. The general contractor was Tishman Realty and Construction Company. At peak, more than 3,500 workers labored on the site. Most were immigrants. Italian, Irish, and German laborers predominated. Mohawk iron workers from the Kanawake Reservation near Montreal worked on the high steel. The Mohawk had been working on skyscraper construction since the 1880s. They were considered fearless at heights, walking narrow beams hundreds of feet above the ground with no safety harnesses. The job was extraordinarily dangerous. Men worked on open steel frameworks swaying in the wind. They caught red-hot rivets thrown from portable forges. They bolted steel beams into place while standing on structures that had no railings, no nets, no protection. A slip meant death. Workers were expected to be careful. Those who showed fear were dismissed. The job required constant attention and steady nerves. Steel arrived from mills in Pennsylvania on precise schedules. Trucks delivered beams to the site where cranes hoisted them immediately to the working level. Nothing sat idle. The pace was relentless. Workers completed approximately one floor every week. By December 1970, the North Tower's steel frame had topped out at 110 floors. The South Tower followed in July 1971. Prefabricated components accelerated construction. Exterior wall sections arrived as three-story modules, 3 columns wide. They were welded together on site, creating the distinctive vertical lines of closely spaced columns. The official death toll was 60 workers, 60 men killed during 7 years of construction. Falls were the primary cause. Men slipped from beams. Cranes dropped loads. Scaffolding collapsed. One worker fell 55 stories to his death. Others were crushed by equipment. Some died in elevator shaft accidents. The names of most victims were never published. Their deaths were recorded in Port Authority safety reports and forgotten. 60 deaths. For comparison, the Empire State Building reported 5 deaths among 3,400 workers. The Chrysler Building reported 0 deaths among 3,000 workers. The World Trade Center's death toll was 12 times higher per worker than the Empire State Building. It was the deadliest skyscraper construction project in New York City history. Only the Brooklyn Bridge, built in the 1880s when safety standards barely existed, killed more workers adjusted for project size. The Port Authority did not commemorate the dead. No plaque listed their names. No memorial acknowledged their sacrifice. The workers had been expendable. They were paid wages. When they died, their families received settlements and were asked to remain silent. Publicizing construction deaths would harm the project's reputation. The Port Authority wanted success stories, not tragedies. The dead were absorbed into the foundations and forgotten. The first tenants moved into the North Tower in December 1970, while the building was still under construction. Offices in the South Tower became available in January 1972. The Port Authority moved its headquarters into the complex. More than 100 companies involved in international trade took space. But the towers struggled to attract tenants. Most floors remained vacant. The World Trade Center had been built on the assumption that concentrating trade-related businesses would create synergies and demand. The assumption was wrong. By the time the towers opened, the concept of consolidating trade services was obsolete. Modern telecommunications and air travel had made physical proximity unnecessary. Banks, shippers, and customs brokers could work from anywhere. They did not need to be in the same building. More importantly, most businesses had no interest in moving to Lower Manhattan. Midtown remained the prestige address. The World Trade Center towers were too far downtown, too isolated, too inconvenient. The ribbon-cutting ceremony took place on April 4, 1973. By that time, the total cost had reached $900 million, more than double the original estimate. The towers were the tallest buildings in the world, surpassing the Empire State Building after its 40-year reign. They would hold the title for only 1 year. In 1974, the Sears Tower in Chicago would rise to 1,450 feet, taking the record. The towers were not well received. Architectural critics called them bland, arrogant, inhumane. Ada Louise Huxtable, the New York Times architecture critic, wrote that they were pure technology, the lobbies are pure schmaltz, and the impact on New York is pure speculation. She called the Gothic arches at the base General Motors Gothic. Other critics called them filing cabinets, vertical prisons, monuments to greed. The towers were so large they created their own wind patterns. Gusts at street level were so strong, pedestrians struggled to walk through the plaza. New Yorkers hated them. They mocked the towers as Rockefeller's folly, as Nelson and David's last erection, as monuments to political corruption and corporate excess. The Port Authority had used its immunity from local zoning laws to demolish a vibrant neighborhood and build structures that violated every principle of good urban design. The towers were superblocks that destroyed the street grid. They created vast, wind-swept plazas that were hostile to pedestrians. They overwhelmed the surrounding buildings. They were everything wrong with modernist urban renewal. And they stood mostly empty. Through the 1970s, occupancy hovered around 60%. The Port Authority tried to fill the space by turning down its own rule that tenants must be involved in international trade. They accepted any company willing to pay rent. State and federal agencies took space. The Port Authority moved more of its own offices into the complex, but commercial tenants remained scarce. The towers that were supposed to revitalize Lower Manhattan were financial failures. The one element that worked was the observation deck. Windows on the World, a restaurant and bar complex, opened on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower in 1976. It offered spectacular views and became wildly popular. The observation deck on the South Tower attracted millions of tourists. Visitors paid a few dollars to ride elevators to the 110th floor and look out over the city. The views were extraordinary. On clear days, visibility extended 50 miles. The observation deck generated more revenue per square foot than many of the office floors below. Windows on the World became one of the highest-grossing restaurants in the United States. By 2000, it was generating $37 million in annual revenue. The restaurant's success was symbolic. The towers had been built as office buildings, monuments to commerce and international trade. They survived as tourist attractions. Through the 1980s, the towers slowly became more accepted. They appeared in films, television shows, postcards. King Kong climbed them in the 1976 remake. Superman flew past them. Woody Allen filmed them in Manhattan. The distinctive silhouette, two identical rectangular towers side by side, became instantly recognizable. The towers were no longer just buildings. They were symbols. They represented New York City, American capitalism, global commerce, modernity itself. But the towers remained vulnerable. On February 26, 1993, at 12:18 p.m., a bomb exploded in the underground parking garage beneath the North Tower. The bomb had been built by Ramzi Yousef, a Pakistani terrorist who had entered the United States 5 months earlier on a fraudulent Iraqi passport. Yousef was trained in bomb-making at camps in Afghanistan. He was motivated by opposition to U.S. support for Israel and American intervention in the Middle East. He wanted to punish America by killing American civilians. Yousef recruited several accomplices, mostly Arab immigrants living in New Jersey. They assembled a 1,500-pound bomb using urea nitrate, nitric acid, and compressed hydrogen. They packed the explosives into a yellow Ryder van. On the morning of February 26th, Yusuf and an associate, Iyad Ismail, drove the van into the North Tower's parking garage. They parked on the B2 level, directly beneath the tower's central support columns. Yusuf lit a 20-foot fuse and fled. 6 people died: Robert Kirkpatrick, Stephen Knapp, William Macco, Wilfredo Mercado, Monica Rodriguez-Smith, and John DiGiovanni. They were in the wrong place when the bomb detonated. Kirkpatrick was a mechanical engineer doing work in the parking garage. Knapp was a Port Authority maintenance worker. DiGiovanni was a dental salesman visiting a client. Monica Rodriguez-Smith was 7 months pregnant. They were killed instantly by the blast or crushed by falling debris. More than 1,000 people were injured. Many suffered smoke inhalation as they evacuated down darkened stairwells. Some were trapped in elevators for hours. Approximately 50,000 people evacuated the towers that day. The evacuation took several hours. Many workers were terrified. They had no way of knowing whether the building was stable or whether more attacks were coming. But the towers held. Yusuf's structural design had worked. The explosion damaged the parking garage and killed 6 people, but the towers did not collapse. Yusuf escaped. He was on a flight to Pakistan that evening. He left behind his accomplices, who were less competent. Mohammed Salame, one of the conspirators, had rented the Ryder van. He reported it stolen to police on February 25th, establishing an alibi. After the bombing, Salame returned to the rental agency on March 4th to claim his $400 deposit. FBI agents arrested him. His arrest led investigators to other members of the group. By early April, 4 suspects were in custody. Yusuf remained free. He traveled to Pakistan, then the Philippines. He planned more attacks, including an elaborate plot called Bojinka to blow up 11 U.S. commercial aircraft simultaneously over the Pacific Ocean. In January 1995, a fire in his Manila apartment alerted Philippine authorities. Yusuf fled, but his plans were discovered. In February 1995, Pakistani intelligence and U.S. agents captured him in Islamabad. He was extradited to the United States. The trial revealed the scope of Yusuf's ambition. He had wanted the explosion to topple the North Tower into the South Tower, bringing down both buildings and killing tens of thousands. The bomb had been too small and poorly placed. Yusuf told investigators he was disappointed the towers had not fallen. He said he would have used more explosives if he had known how much was needed. In January 1998, Yusuf was sentenced to life in prison plus 240 years. 4 other conspirators received 240-year sentences. A 7th plotter, Abdul Rahman Yassin, remained at large. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Yusuf's maternal uncle, had helped plan the attack. He would later mastermind September 11. The 1993 bombing forced changes at the World Trade Center. The Port Authority installed better ventilation systems to prevent smoke from spreading through the towers. They improved emergency lighting and communication systems. They added more security personnel and restricted parking garage access. But the towers remained fundamentally vulnerable. They were targets. Everyone knew it. The question was whether the next attack could be stopped. Through the late 1990s, the towers finally achieved financial success. New York's economy boomed. The dot-com bubble inflated. Financial services firms expanded. Office space became scarce. By 2001, the World Trade Center was approximately 95% occupied. The towers that had struggled for decades were finally profitable. The Port Authority decided to privatize them. In July 2001, the Port Authority awarded a 99-year lease to Silverstein Properties and the Westfield Group. The lease was valued at $3.2 billion. Larry Silverstein, a New York real estate developer, would control the towers. 6 weeks later, they would be destroyed. The morning of September 11, 2001 was clear and bright. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston Logan International Airport bound for Los Angeles. Aboard were 81 passengers, 11 crew members, and 5 hijackers. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 17 departed Boston Logan, also bound for Los Angeles. Aboard were 56 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers. The hijackers were members of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization led by Osama bin Laden. They had trained for months, learning to fly commercial aircraft at flight schools in Florida and Arizona. Their plan was simple and catastrophic. They would hijack 4 planes and crash them into prominent American buildings. 2 planes would target the World Trade Center, 1 would target the Pentagon, the 4th would target either the White House or the Capitol. Flight 11 was hijacked at 8:14 a.m., almost immediately after takeoff. The lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, was a 33-year-old Egyptian who had studied urban planning in Germany before joining Al-Qaeda. He and 4 accomplices overpowered the flight attendants, forced their way into the cockpit, and murdered both pilots. Flight attendant Betty Ong called American Airlines ground operations on 8:19 a.m. and reported the hijacking. She said the cockpit was unreachable and passengers had been stabbed. The call lasted 25 minutes. Ong remained calm, providing crucial information until the moment of impact. At 8:24 a.m., Atta accidentally broadcast over the air traffic control frequency instead of the plane's intercom. Controllers heard him say, "We have some planes. Just stay quiet and you'll be okay. We are returning to the airport." Then, "Nobody move. Everything will be okay. If you try to make any moves, you'll endanger yourself and the airplane. Just stay quiet." Air traffic controllers immediately knew something was wrong. They alerted the military's Northeast Air Defense Sector at 8:40 a.m. Fighter jets were scrambled from Otis Air Force Base in Massachusetts, but they were too late. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower between the 93rd and 99th floors, traveling approximately 465 miles per hour. The aircraft carried roughly 10,000 gallons of jet fuel. The impact killed everyone on board instantly. The plane weighed approximately 150,000 pounds and struck the building with the force of a small bomb. The collision severed all 3 emergency stairwells in the North Tower's impact zone. Everyone above the 91st floor was trapped. No one at or above the point of impact survived. The impact was felt throughout Lower Manhattan. Thousands of people looked up and saw a massive hole torn in the tower's north face. Flames poured from the building. Paper and debris rained onto the streets below. Millions watching morning news broadcasts saw the North Tower burning and assumed it was a terrible accident. A small plane had lost its way. A pilot had made a catastrophic error. Flight 175 was hijacked between 8:42 and 8:46 a.m., approximately the same time Flight 11 struck the North Tower. The lead hijacker, Marwan al-Shehi, was a 23-year-old from the United Arab Emirates who had been Atta's roommate in Germany. He and his team killed both pilots and took control of the aircraft. Unlike Flight 11, the hijackers on Flight 175 did not turn off the plane's transponder. Air traffic controllers could see the plane deviating from its assigned flight path. They tried repeatedly to contact the cockpit. There was no response. At 8:52 a.m., flight attendant Robert Fangman called United Airlines' San Francisco office. He reported that the plane had been hijacked, both pilots had been killed, a flight attendant had been stabbed, and the hijackers were flying the plane. The call was brief. Then the line went dead. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashed into the South Tower between the 77th and 85th floors, traveling approximately 590 miles per hour. The impact was broadcast live on television. Millions of people watched the second plane strike the tower, and at that moment, everyone understood. This was not an accident. America was under attack. The impact severed 2 of the 3 emergency stairwells in the South Tower. Only Stairwell A remained partially intact. Some people trapped above the 77th floor were able to descend through Stairwell A and escape. 18 people from the impact zone successfully evacuated. It was the only stairwell left functional in either tower above the impact zones. In the North Tower, all 3 stairwells had been destroyed. No one trapped above the 91st floor had any way to escape. The jet fuel ignited immediately. Both towers were engulfed in flames. The fire temperature reached approximately 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the melting point of steel, but hot enough to weaken it significantly. The floor trusses connecting the exterior walls to the central core began to sag under the heat. As they sagged, they pulled the exterior walls inward. The walls began to buckle. Inside the towers, thousands of people were trapped. Above the impact zones, workers gathered at windows. The heat and smoke were unbearable. Some broke windows to get air. Others called family members on cell phones to say goodbye. Many made the choice to jump rather than burn. Over the next hour and 42 minutes, more than 200 people fell or jumped from the towers. Most came from the North Tower, where conditions were worse. They fell from windows on the north and east faces, tumbling through the air, their bodies striking the ground with sickening impact. Photographers captured their descent. One image, later titled "The Falling Man," showed a man falling head first, his body vertical, his posture almost serene. The photograph became iconic and controversial. Many found it unbearable to look at. It depicted what we wanted to forget. At 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after impact, the South Tower collapsed. The top floors, weakened by fire, gave way. The structure above the impact zone dropped, and the weight crushed the floors below in a progressive collapse. Each floor fell onto the one beneath it, creating a chain reaction. The entire 110-story tower collapsed in approximately 10 seconds. A massive cloud of dust and debris exploded outward, filling the streets of Lower Manhattan with pulverized concrete, glass, steel, asbestos, office furniture, and human remains. The collapse killed everyone still inside the tower. It also killed dozens of firefighters, police officers, and emergency workers in the streets below and in the North Tower. Emergency radios had been malfunctioning. Many responders did not hear the evacuation order. They were still climbing stairs inside the North Tower when the South Tower fell. The North Tower stood for another 29 minutes. Inside, thousands of people below the impact zone continued evacuating. The stairwells were narrow and crowded. Smoke filled the building. Some people stopped to rest. Others became disoriented. The injured moved slowly. Many were helping colleagues who could not walk. The evacuation was chaotic, but largely orderly. Most people below the impact zone survived. Most above it did not. At 10:28 a.m., 102 minutes after impact, the North Tower collapsed. Like the South Tower, the top floors fell first, crushing everything below. The entire structure came down in seconds. The collapse killed everyone still inside. It killed more firefighters and police officers. It killed people on the streets who had not gotten far enough away. The dust cloud engulfed Lower Manhattan, turning day into night. The death toll at the World Trade Center was 2,753. This includes 2,192 civilians, 343 firefighters, 71 law enforcement officers, and 147 passengers and crew from the 2 aircraft. The victims came from 90 countries. They were janitors and executives, waiters and stockbrokers, security guards and bond traders. Windows on the World restaurant on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower had 72 employees and 16 customers present when Flight 11 struck. All died. Cantor Fitzgerald, a financial services firm that occupied floors 101 to 105 of the North Tower, lost 658 employees, nearly 70% of its workforce. The youngest victim was Christine Hansen, 2 years old, a passenger on Flight 175. The oldest was Robert Norton, 85, a passenger on Flight 11. Some victims were incinerated, some were crushed, some jumped, some were lost entirely, their remains never identified. The collapse had pulverized much of the towers. Dust covered lower Manhattan. In that dust were fragments of concrete, glass, steel, and human tissue. Recovery workers spent months searching the rubble. They found body parts, they collected DNA samples, they identified what they could. By 2002, only 1,600 victims had been identified. The rest remained unknown or were represented by fragments so small they could not be matched to any individual. The medical examiner's office still holds approximately 10,000 unidentified bone and tissue fragments. They may never be identified. The technology does not exist. The towers had fallen not because the aircraft destroyed them, but because the fire weakened the floor trusses. As the trusses sagged, they pulled the exterior walls inward. Once the walls buckled, the structure could no longer support the weight above the impact zone. The top floors fell, initiating the collapse. The design that had made the towers economically feasible, the framed tube with lightweight floor trusses, had made them vulnerable to this specific scenario. Yamasaki and Khan had not anticipated that a plane loaded with fuel would strike the building and burn for an hour. No one had. The death toll has continued to rise. Thousands of firefighters, police officers, construction workers, and volunteers who worked at Ground Zero in the weeks and months after the attacks developed illnesses from exposure to toxic dust. The dust contained asbestos, lead, mercury, pulverized concrete, glass fibers, and countless other hazardous materials. By 2014, more than 1,400 responders had died from 9/11-related illnesses. The total is now over 3,000 and climbing. More people have died from exposure to Ground Zero dust than died in the towers on September 11. The dead include construction workers who never worked on the original towers. They worked on the cleanup. They breathed the dust. They developed cancer, lung disease, autoimmune disorders. Many were young men in their 40s and 50s. They died decades before their time. Their names have been added to the memorial. The death toll from September 11th has no final number. People are still dying. The site was cleared by May 2002. All that remained was the bathtub, the concrete retaining wall that had kept the Hudson River out. It had survived the collapse. Around it, a vast pit extended 7 stories below street level. That pit became known as Ground Zero. It became sacred ground, a place where thousands had died, a place that demanded remembrance. The memorial opened on September 11, 2011, 10 years after the attacks. It consists of 2 enormous reflecting pools set within the footprints of the original towers. Water cascades down the sides into the pools, creating a constant sound that drowns out the city noise. Around the edges of each pool, bronze panels bear the names of every person who died on September 11, 2001, and in the 1993 bombing. 2,983 names. The memorial cost $700 million. It occupies 8 acres. Millions visit each year. They trace names with their fingers. They place flowers in the carved letters. They take photographs. They remember. But the memorial does not include the names of the 60 workers who died building the towers. Those men are commemorated nowhere. Their deaths occurred before the towers became symbols. They died when the towers were just construction sites, just another job, just steel and concrete rising from the ground. Their names appear in no database. Their families receive no invitation to the memorial dedication. They are forgotten. The pattern is familiar. The workers who built the Empire State Building were forgotten. The workers who built the Brooklyn Bridge were forgotten. The workers who built the Panama Canal, the Hoover Dam, the Golden Gate Bridge, all forgotten. Construction deaths are absorbed into the cost of the project. The monument matters. The men who died building it do not. The 1993 bombing victims are included on the memorial. Their 6 names appear among the 2,983, but their deaths receive less attention. They were killed by a bomb that failed to accomplish its goal. The towers stood for 8 more years. The 1993 attack was a prelude, a warning that nobody heeded. Ramzi Youssef told investigators he wanted to kill 250,000 people. He failed. His uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, would try again with a better plan. The September 11th memorial is beautiful and solemn. It honors the dead with dignity. But it also performs a specific kind of forgetting. It separates the attack from the context. The towers appear only as absence, as voids where buildings once stood. The memorial does not explain why the towers were built or what they represented. It does not mention David Rockefeller or the destruction of Radio Row. It does not discuss the financial struggles or the architectural criticism. The towers exist in the memorial only as symbols of innocence destroyed. This is a choice. Memorials always choose what to remember and what to forget. The September 11th memorial remembers the victims. It forgets the hubris. It forgets that the towers were monuments to power and greed before they became monuments to tragedy. It forgets that they were hated before they were loved. It forgets that they stood mostly empty for years. It forgets that they were profitable for only a few years before they were destroyed. The memorial also forgets the broader context of American foreign policy. It does not explain why Al-Qaeda targeted the United States. It does not mention decades of U.S. intervention in the Middle East, support for authoritarian regimes, military presence in Saudi Arabia, or unwavering support for Israel regardless of its treatment of Palestinians. These are not justifications for mass murder. Nothing justifies killing 2,977 innocent people. But context matters. The towers were targeted because they symbolized American economic and military power. That power had consequences. The memorial erases those consequences. What remains is pure victimhood. The towers were innocent. America was innocent. The dead were innocent. The attack came from nowhere, motivated by hatred of American freedom and values. This narrative is emotionally satisfying. It provides clear heroes and villains. It requires no uncomfortable reflection about American actions abroad. It transforms a political act of terrorism into an existential attack on civilization itself. The narrative works because the victims were genuinely innocent. The people who died in the towers on September 11th had nothing to do with U.S. foreign policy. They were office workers, restaurant staff, janitors, security guards, tourists. They went to work that morning expecting an ordinary day. They were murdered because of what the buildings symbolized, not because of anything they personally had done. Their innocence is absolute. But the towers themselves were not innocent. They were built to serve power. David Rockefeller built them to increase his property values and restore his family's prestige. The Port Authority built them to justify its existence and control of revenue streams. They were imposed on a neighborhood that did not want them, destroying 1,000 small businesses and displacing 30,000 workers. They killed 60 men during construction. They stood as monuments to corporate capitalism and American dominance. They were targets precisely because of what they represented. The memorial collapses this complexity. It offers only grief. That is its purpose. Memorials are not history. They are therapy. They help survivors process trauma. They provide a place for mourning. The September 11th Memorial does this well. It is beautiful. It is moving. Millions have found comfort there. But it does not tell the whole truth. It cannot. The whole truth is too complicated. The whole truth includes the 60 construction workers whose names nobody knows. It includes the financial failure and the architectural criticism. It includes David Rockefeller's greed and the Port Authority's corruption. It includes decades of American foreign policy that made the towers targets. It includes the reality that the towers were hated before they were loved. All of this is erased. What remains is the spectacle of grief. The memorial's success depends on this erasure. If visitors understood the full context, if they knew about the construction deaths and the financial struggles and the reasons Al-Qaeda chose these specific buildings, the emotional experience would be different. The grief would be complicated by questions. The innocence would be tainted by complicity. The memorial would become a place of difficult reflection rather than pure mourning. So the complexity is removed. The towers appear only as symbols. The victims appear only as names. The attackers appear only as evil. The story is simplified until it can be absorbed emotionally without requiring thought. This is how memorials work. This is how nations process trauma. Simplify, sanctify, forget. One World Trade Center, the tower built to replace the twins, opened in November 2014. It stands 1,776 feet tall, a symbolic height referencing American independence. The building cost $3.9 billion. It is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. The design, by architect David Childs, is meant to evoke strength and resilience. The tower rises from a square base and transforms into an octagon as it ascends. The top is crowned with a 408-foot spire. The building is nothing like the Twin Towers. It is triangular rather than rectangular. It is a single tower rather than twins. It has setbacks and visual complexity rather than stark simplicity. The design committee rejected anything that resembled Yamasaki's towers. They wanted something entirely different. The Twin Towers had failed. Their design had made them vulnerable. The replacement would be safer, stronger, better. But One World Trade Center is also a monument. It cost billions to build and houses office space that generates rental income. The tower is approximately 60% occupied as of 2024. Many floors remain vacant. The building struggles to attract tenants for the same reason the original towers struggled. Lower Manhattan is still not the most desirable location. Midtown remains the prestige address. One World Trade Center survives partly on symbolism. Companies rent space to demonstrate patriotism and resilience, not because the location is optimal. The tower has an observation deck on the 100th, 101st, and 102nd floors. It opened in 2015 and attracts millions of visitors. The admission price is approximately $45. Visitors ride elevators to the top and look out over the city. The views are extraordinary. On clear days, visibility extends 50 miles. The observation deck generates substantial revenue. Like the Twin Towers before it, One World Trade Center earns more from tourism than from its office tenants. The pattern repeats. The tower, built to house corporations, survives by selling views to tourists. The monument, meant to demonstrate American resilience, actually demonstrates the limits of commercial real estate in a location nobody wants. But the symbolism matters more than the economics. One World Trade Center exists to prove that America recovered, that terrorists did not win, that the towers have been replaced. The replacement is a lie. The Twin Towers are gone. They cannot be replaced. The new tower is taller, but smaller in total square footage. It is one building, not two. It does not dominate the skyline the way the twins did. It is safer, more expensive, less iconic. It is a monument to fear, disguised as a monument to strength. Every security measure, every setback from the street, every reinforced wall announces that we expect another attack. The tower will never be what the twins were, because the twins were destroyed. That destruction is their meaning now. The towers exist in memory as victims, not as arrogant corporate monuments they actually were. They have been sanctified by their destruction. All their flaws have been forgiven. The hatred they inspired has been forgotten. They are remembered only as beautiful, iconic, and unjustly destroyed. This transformation is complete. The towers that New Yorkers mocked in the 1970s are now beloved. The structures that critics called inhumane are now mourned as architectural treasures. The buildings that stood mostly empty for decades are now remembered as vibrant centers of commerce destroyed at their peak. None of this is true, but it is what we believe. Memory is more powerful than history. The question that remains is whether the truth matters. The towers are gone. The 2,977 people who died on September 11th are dead. The 60 workers who died building the towers are dead. The 6 people killed in 1993 are dead. The thousands who have died from exposure to ground zero dust are dead. No amount of historical accuracy will bring them back. No acknowledgement of complexity will ease the grief. Perhaps the memorial is exactly what it should be. A place to mourn without complication. A place where the dead are honored without context. A place where visitors can feel grief without feeling complicit. The towers were symbols. They remain symbols. Symbols do not require truth. They require meaning. But there is a cost to this choice. The cost is the construction workers whose names appear nowhere. The cost is the full accounting of why the towers were built and who benefited from their construction. The cost is understanding that monuments to power attract violence because that is what power does. It creates symbols worth attacking. The Twin Towers were not destroyed because they were beautiful or because they represented freedom. They were destroyed because they represented American economic and military dominance. That dominance had been imposed through decades of intervention, support for dictatorships, military occupations, and unwavering backing of allies regardless of their actions. This does not justify the attacks. Nothing justifies mass murder, but it explains them, and explanation is not the same as justification. We can acknowledge why something happened without condoning it. We can understand the attackers' motivations without agreeing with their methods. We can recognize that American foreign policy created enemies without blaming the victims for being murdered. The memorial does not allow this complexity. It offers only innocence and evil. This is emotionally satisfying, but intellectually dishonest. The world is more complicated than memorials acknowledge. The towers were more complicated than we remember. The attack was more complicated than we want to admit. What is certain is that the towers are gone. They stood for 28 years. They struggled financially for most of that time. They were hated, then tolerated, then loved only after their destruction. They killed 60 workers during construction. They survived a bombing that killed 6. They were destroyed by an attack that killed 2,977 and continues killing thousands more. The towers have been replaced by a memorial and a new tower. The memorial remembers some of the dead and forgets others. The new tower claims to represent resilience, but actually represents fear. Neither can restore what was lost. Neither can undo what happened. The Twin Towers endured everything except the one thing they could not survive. They survived construction deaths. They survived financial failure. They survived criticism and mockery. They survived a bombing. They could not survive being symbols. That is what killed them, not the planes or the fire or the structural failure, the symbolism. They represented something worth destroying. They represented American economic and military dominance. That dominance had been imposed through decades of intervention, support for dictatorships, military occupations, and unwavering backing of allies, regardless of their actions. This does not justify the attacks. Nothing justifies mass murder, but it explains them. And explanation is not the same as justification. We can acknowledge why something happened without condoning it. We can understand the attackers' motivations without agreeing with their methods. We can recognize that American foreign policy created enemies without blaming the victims for being murdered. The memorial does not allow this complexity. It offers only innocence and evil. This is emotionally satisfying, but intellectually dishonest. The world is more complicated than memorials acknowledge. The towers were more complicated than we remember. The attack was more complicated than we want to admit. What is certain is that the towers are gone. They stood for 28 years. They struggled financially for most of that time. They were hated, then tolerated, then loved only after their destruction. They killed 60 workers during construction. They survived a bombing that killed 6. They were destroyed by an attack that killed 2,977 and continues killing thousands more. The towers have been replaced by a memorial and a new tower. The memorial remembers some of the dead and forgets others. The new tower claims to represent resilience, but actually represents fear. Neither can restore what was lost. Neither can undo what happened. The Twin Towers endured everything except the one thing they could not survive. They survived construction deaths. They survived financial failure. They survived criticism and mockery. They survived a bombing. They could not survive being symbols. That is what killed them, not the planes or the fire or the structural failure, the symbolism. They represented something worth destroying. They represented American economic and military dominance. That dominance had been imposed through decades of intervention, support for dictatorships, military occupations, and unwavering backing of allies, regardless of their actions. This does not justify the attacks. Nothing justifies mass murder, but it explains them. And explanation is not the same as justification. We can acknowledge why something happened without condoning it. We can understand the attackers' motivations without agreeing with their methods. We can recognize that American foreign policy created enemies without blaming the victims for being murdered. The memorial does not allow this complexity. It offers only innocence and evil. This is emotionally satisfying, but intellectually dishonest. The world is more complicated than memorials acknowledge. The towers were more complicated than we remember. The attack was more complicated than we want to admit. What is certain is that the towers are gone. They stood for 28 years. They struggled financially for most of that time. They were hated, then tolerated, then loved only after their destruction. They killed 60 workers during construction. They survived a bombing that killed 6. They were destroyed by an attack that killed 2,977 and continues killing thousands more. The towers have been replaced by a memorial and a new. The 2,977 who died on September 11th are remembered because their deaths fit the narrative perfectly. They were innocent victims of evil. Their deaths require no context, no explanation beyond hatred of American values. They can be mourned purely, without complication. They serve the story we need. But both groups are dead. Both groups matter. Both groups deserve remembrance. The towers consumed them all. The construction workers fell from steel beams and were forgotten. The office workers burned in jet fuel and became symbols. The difference is not in their deaths. The difference is in what we choose to do with those deaths. The towers are gone. What remains is our choice about what they meant and who deserves to be remembered. We have chosen. We remember the victims of September 11th with a beautiful memorial. We forget the construction workers entirely. We simplify the story until it becomes myth. And the myth is powerful because it is simple. Innocence destroyed, evil punished, resilience demonstrated, the towers rebuilt. But the truth is more complicated. The towers were built on the bodies of forgotten workers. They were imposed on a neighborhood that did not want them. They struggled for decades and succeeded briefly before being destroyed. They were targets because of what they represented, not because of any inherent evil in their design. Their destruction killed thousands and continues killing thousands more. Their replacement is a monument to fear, pretending to be a monument to strength. This is the story we do not tell. This is the cost we forget. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center stand in memory as symbols. In reality, they were buildings. Buildings built by workers who died. Buildings that killed again when they fell. Buildings that continue killing through the dust they left behind. The towers are gone. The dead remain dead, and we choose what to remember. We have chosen mythology over history, simplicity over complexity, innocence over accountability. This is how monuments work. They stand, they inspire, they become symbols, and then they require blood to maintain their meaning. The Twin Towers required blood during construction. They required blood when they were bombed. They required blood when they fell. And they require blood now, in the form of forgetting, to remain the symbols we need them to be. Each night, the tribute in light illuminates the sky where the towers stood. 2 beams of light rise from lower Manhattan, visible for 60 miles. They appear on September 11th each year. The lights are beautiful. They are moving. They are inadequate. Light cannot replace what was lost. Light cannot acknowledge what was forgotten. Light cannot tell the truth. But light is what we offer. Light and names carved in bronze. Light and a memorial that simplifies. Light and a story that erases context. The towers are gone. The lights shine, and we tell ourselves we remember. We remember what we choose to remember. We forget the rest. That is what monuments do. They stand, they persist, they survive, and we look at them, admiring their meaning, forgetting what they cost, honoring them in ways that erase the truth they contain. The Twin Towers have won. They are more famous destroyed than they ever were standing. They are more beloved as memory than they ever were as buildings. They have become symbols of innocence, of loss, of American resilience. They have been purified by their destruction. All their flaws have been burned away. What remains is perfect. What remains is myth. And the 60 construction workers remain forgotten. Their names appear nowhere. Their sacrifice means nothing. The towers they built became symbols. They did not. That is the final cost, the cost we chose, the cost we continue choosing. The towers stand in memory, perfect and innocent. The workers who built them remain buried in forgotten Port Authority reports, absorbed into the foundations, erased from history. The towers endure. The men who built them do not. That is what monuments do. They consume those who create them and reward those who come after. The Twin Towers consumed everyone. Construction workers in the 1960s, bombing victims in 1993, thousands on September 11th, thousands more in the years since. The towers are gone. The dead accumulate. And we light the sky each year, remembering what we choose, forgetting the rest.